All right, and that is a live look at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. We are going to keep our focus on Washington and the NATO summit. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will be meeting with the Senate Majority Leader this morning, as well as a group of Democratic and Republican senators. Evan Dyer is with our CBC News team covering the NATO summit. Good morning, Evan. Tell us why the Prime Minister is meeting with U.S. lawmakers this morning.
Well, Chris, this is an effort to assuage concerns in Congress about Canada's defense spending, partly. We saw back in May a letter sent by a bipartisan group of senators that criticized Canada for not having made more of an effort to get up to the NATO defense spending threshold, which is a minimum of 2% of gross domestic product spent on defense every year. And that's the floor, not the ceiling. That commitment has existed since about 2024, and Canada, of course, is far short of that. It's at about 1.37%. And what actually concerns people in Congress more, in both parties, is that there doesn't appear to be a plan to get to 2% in this decade. In fact, looking at all the spending announcements that have already been made, Canadian defense spending would still be below 1.8% in the year 2030. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says it would actually be even lower than that, so because he's using a different set of calculations to measure the Canadian economy. So we saw both the Democratic and Republican heads of the U.S. Senate NATO Observers Group co-sign a letter in this very partisan town that tells you you have an issue when you're getting both parties sharing a criticism of your government. And that's exactly what happened. They said that they were concerned and profoundly disappointed that since Vilnius, the NATO summit last year in Lithuania, where there was renewed pressure for everybody to meet this commitment, a whole bunch of countries have stepped up and done so. And the number of countries that aren't meeting the threshold, which used to be the majority of NATO, is now only 9 members out of 32. And of those, the only really big one that doesn't have a plan to get there is Canada, and that is putting a bigger target on Canada's back. So these meetings today will be with the head of the Democratic minority in Congress, Hakeem Jeffries, and also with Chuck Schumer, the majority leader in Senate, but they'll be meeting also with Republican members of Congress to try to make the point that there is more spending coming and that Canada still does intend to continue to raise its defense spending.
Yeah, we'll bring developments that come out of those conversations. Evan, we've been talking about the questions around Joe Biden, but of course, his rival in the presidential election is Donald Trump. So if Trump returns to the White House, what kind of pressure could Canada face over defense spending?
Well, we said that the pressure is bipartisan, but we should also add that it's of a very different nature when President Donald Trump was in office, or if he comes back into office, than it is under a Democratic administration. The pressure is much more intense. And we spoke yesterday with a former defense official of the last Trump administration, someone who's also being floated as a likely national security advisor in any future Trump administration, Elbridge Colby. And he suggested that the U.S. would use all kinds of levers of pressure, trade levers, potential expulsion from the G7, which of course is not, strictly speaking, within the U.S.'s gift to decide who's a G7 member. It is not the head of that body. It is simply another member. But he certainly took some very strong shots, and I think they give a sense of the tone from a Republican administration as opposed to a Democratic administration. Let's listen.
Given how important burden sharing and collective defense are, that we use instruments of economic, essentially economic benefits of access to the American market or American technology, I think those are all fair game. But I mean, look, who's being unreasonable here? The United States actually expecting Canada to meet its responsibilities, or a Canadian government that's openly flouting? In fact, it's not the United States that's isolated. This Politico article showed that Canada is actually being seen in a very negative way on this front by a lot of the European countries as well.
So he's referring there to an article where indeed there was some criticism of Canada coming also from Europe. We see countries like Poland spending a lot more. So he's talking about things like withholding U.S. technology from Canada, measures that have never been taken before. But actually the one that most concerns NATO insiders is one that he didn't mention, and that's Donald Trump's references to Article 5, where he suggested that countries that contribute less to NATO might not get defended if they get attacked. And that is the threat that really threatens to perhaps break up NATO, to make countries question whether it's worth being a member of an alliance that no longer has that ironclad guarantee of mutual defense. So definitely the Trump administration would change the nature of the tone of the argument about spending in NATO, and it would have a lot of people inside NATO worried about the continued survival of the alliance.
Appreciate the insight. Thank you so much for that reporting. Evan Dyer live in Washington, D.C.